For the record, this is Anne Marie. Thank you so much, Jesse. So as we said, we have a couple of presentations today, followed by a Q&A by our board and subcommittee members. And first up, we're going to be hearing a presentation from Bob Otis to talk about the Sacred Garden community. Bob, are you present and ready to go?
Hi, yes, I'm here. Thankful to be here.
Wonderful. And can you state your name for the record, please?
Hi, Robert Bob Otis Stanley.
Great, thank you. And I'll let you present.
Yeah, well, first I just want to take a minute and really express gratitude for this little group here, which may even be kind of forming its own community. So just gratitude to be in community with everyone here, and particularly for the work that you're doing and that we can be here, and even just to take a step back and consider my role as a pastor within Sacred Garden community, and just to express all that we can even be together, that we can even just experience a breath, that we are seeking healing together. We're seeking to be supporting healing together. I'm very thankful for what I sense are the shared intentions of this group. May the time that I spend with you and the time that we spend together bring us into the direction that we're seeking to go, into who we truly are, and particularly for healing and insight and joy for our communities. Thank you. Yeah. So I thought maybe often what I do is, a lot of my role is to kind of share experience and needs from the ground, from a place of practice and from a place of long practice. So I don't have a lot of documents to share, but I thought I would kind of share how things go within Sacred Garden community. And I probably should start with a little bio, also to bring up any awareness, transparency, so just to avoid any perception of conflict and that sort of thing. So I'll just kind of try to give a brief bio. I've been working in this space. I was really fortunate to be able to approach my father openly. Even when I was 17 years old, he was a surgeon and the chief of staff at our hospital in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. And I had been able to explore his library and had found books by Charles Tart and John Lilly, and this was a while ago, so these are some of the older books. Carlos Castaneda was there, and so I felt safe to approach him about a really profound and transformative mystical experience I had at age 17, a pretty young age, sitting on the top of a mountain in the Smoky Mountains, and it was really life-changing, and I'm still integrating that experience and subsequent experiences even today. So I've been able to work with family and recognized leadership, formal faculty from Harvard, Psychedelic Club, and those sort of folks for over 35 years. If you search for Bob Otis, Psychedelic Liberty and Diversity, you'll find a really long bio for me online. I think Psychedelics Times published that. I think I was just trying to calculate this out, and I'm confident I've sat in facilitation with over 1,000 practitioners, I think well over. I have a Master's of Divinity from University of Chicago, where I studied with Wendy Doniger, who co-wrote with Richard Evan Schultes. I also have over 20 years of life science research as my above ground profession. I'm the chief garden steward and ordained pastor for Sacred Garden Community Church. I'm the co-founder and chief sacrament officer of Mimosa Public Benefit Corp., co-founded with Amanda Fielding, Jim Keim, and others. There is funding from Bronner Foundation and others associated with that company, just expressing disclosure here. I'm an invited advisory council member to the California SB 519. I'm an advisor to the Oregon PMHA, also recently invited to advise the Colorado Natural Medicine Healing Alliance. I'm also a founding member and steering committee member of the Sacred Plant Alliance of Sacramental. So the little background there. And also want to, I'm not sure how you guys will do this, but if anyone wants to interrupt with questions, I'm happy to receive questions at any time. And
this is Anne Marie for the record. I just want to state that we will open up for public comment at the end. So as far as questions currently are concerned, if board members do have questions, just state your name for the record and we can take it from there.
Perfect. Thank you. Yeah. So I thought I would talk a little bit about Sacred Garden community, particularly in context of the benefits of persisting community as a part of what I'll call healing practice with entheogenic materials. There are a lot of reasons why having sort of some formed organization that is governed can be useful for sacred plant work. and particularly if there's a community of practitioners that can be accessed. One thing I'll kind of bring up right out of the gate that can confuse folks within Sacred Garden community and the trainings that we offer, we call the person who may be holding space the facilitator, and we call the person who is seeking healing or insight the practitioner. So we recognize that the active practice is actually carried by the person who is seeking the experience and engaging the entheogen directly. So that's a little different. Some people think of the practitioner as the facilitator, but we recognize the agency of the person doing the practice. Just want to avoid any confusion when I'm chatting. So Sacred Garden community, we have all those things that you need to have, an internal ethics council, which is separate from the elders council or what is the board equivalent. We're also associated with an external regulatory association. That's the Sacred Plant Alliance that's hosted by Sacramental. So that if there are issues within the church, if there's any question about facilitator impropriety or anything like that, first, there's an opportunity to go to the ethics council with a complaint. The ethics council then raise that to the elders council, and some decision may be made. If there's a conflict between elders and ethics council or some irresolvable conflict, we go out to an external body. And I would sort of generally recommend that whether this is for a therapeutic training association or a little group that's offering hosted facilitation, to have access to an independent ethics council and really probably some external regulatory association, I think is very useful. So this is the sort of thing I know you guys are building in here, so I'm just bringing that up. Trying to decide what's really useful to share. Within Sacred Garden community, we have our own ongoing facilitation and practitioner training. So we really take a lot of time with each person who's seeking healing before we simply drop them into the journey space or the assisted meditation. We'll take at least 3 months with any person who's seeking healing, getting to know that person, asking them to attend at least 8 educational workshops that we offer, moving through a formal process that includes navigation, preparation. We also have an initiatory process, so we don't move the person into the first experience of assisted meditation with a strong experience for the very first experience. We ask the person to move with respect into the process. So we move through navigation, preparation, and then we have a gentle initiation, which is an assisted meditation, but a light one. Depending on how that goes, we may have several initiatory meditations. Then we move into what we call the practice, and that can be deeper assisted meditations. By that time, the facilitation leadership has gotten to know that person and can really identify probably what sacrament would be most useful for them in their practice. That's an interactive relationship where we learn that sort of thing. And then moving the person into the practice from where they are. And that is something that you don't just learn in 1 hour interview, in my opinion. It really helps to take some real time to get to know the person who's seeking a healing before you just drop them in. Just to sort of fly in and have an interview and fly out is not the way that we do things. I feel that can add risk. And have had that experience from just, if you don't really know who you're sitting with, there's a lot of additional risk there. We also then, of course, work through integration. And then something that I think is really important that may get missed is a concept of community integration. Does the person have a place to return to that is healing, that is aligned with the intentions of the process that the person is moving through, right? And so to have some form of community that's transparent and open about the intentions of the community, that it's a community intended for healing, that there are resources for integration within that community and experienced resources for integration is incredibly valuable. There are issues that folks here are probably aware of that can be challenging emerging from an assisted meditation, like, for example, inflation. People may have heard that term. Sometimes a newcomer to the entheogen space will have such a profound experience. It will be such a sense of receiving insight and such a strong sense of having moved through maybe some really deep emotional challenges that person was suffering. Occasionally coming out of that, there can be a real sense of what I'll call, and what Anne Shulgin calls, inflation. That's this sense of, I really learned everything. I'm like a prophet, and I know more than everyone else. And, this sort of thing, that can be a challenge coming out of entheogen work. So having a community, or at least a persisting relationship with an experienced therapist who has seen that sort of thing before, can be very helpful. I was really lucky when I was 17 that I was able to talk to my dad, and my family has a sort of mystic religious background. And he says, Bob, you're not the only person who's experienced God, and, let's talk about this and, kind of ground ourselves. Similarly, a person can come out of journey with a lot of shame or unresolved issues that might have emerged during the journey. Something may be realized that may be very difficult. And if you don't have guidance that this is a process that you can be moving through, and that this is really a good opportunity, having that community with that experience, then that you can actually come out of the assisted meditation with less health, right? And so, but to have that community support then can actually turn that sort of challenging journey into an opportunity. So I think whether this, quote, community is provided by an attuned relationship with a therapist type of sitter or whatever that may be, or through an actual community, having that is incredibly important. At least that's what we believe within Sacred Garden Community based on our experience. So I hope you can hear through this kind of a deliberate harm reduction process that's being built into community structure. In some ways, I feel a big, what we call least dogma church that can hold a lot of diverse faiths. But then we have a common faith, which in our church, it's that the sacraments of our church, approached with care, respect, and trust, can connect us directly to divine presence, to experience of divine presence within this lifetime. That's our common faith, but we can accept many incoming faiths: atheism, Christian, Jewish, Islamic, pagan, you name it. So we're trying to create a strong container that can hold the diversity that we find here in Oakland, but also will have a sincerely shared faith. And in some ways, I feel by trying to create this persisting community framework that has deliberate harm reduction built in, we're recreating some of the benefits that are found in long-term culture that, for example, I've experienced through the many years that I've visited the Sierra Mazatecan region and gotten to know different curanderos and curaderos down there. Each little village, each little valley that will have one or two or several curanderos will have a culture that is integrated with that healing process. And we're lacking that generally here in the United States. So to have an intentionally created community that can provide some of the support frameworks that you may find in other traditional cultures is part of our goal. Just talking kind of about the church and some of the justification for why it exists, and hopefully some of the benefits that we're seeing that might be useful for this group. I will say Sacred Garden Community Church has been practicing for decades. I've been giving plant talks, here in the Bay Area for, I guess, since about 2014 or so, openly, when I started feeling safer to do that. And we've been a formal incorporated church now, I think, for about 2.5 years. Also, I'll just mention seeking that transparency and safety and a sense of openness and what we call care, respect, and trust, a sense of trust and integrity. 3 of the 5 board members for the Decrim Nature Oakland movement, when it was passing through in Oakland, what were Sacred Garden Community. So I was the founding chair of the Decrim Nature group. And that was a part of the ethos that we're trying to share, is one of our commitment and dedication to honesty, openness, transparency, safety. And really for us, for Sacred Garden Community, the Decrim Nature process in Oakland was really like a prayer. It was like a careful, respectful, and trusting request for transparency and safety in Oakland. And I'll be really honest, I kept having these journeys that were puzzling me, where I was receiving first years ago, there's nothing to be ashamed of. You don't need to be hiding. And then I guess around 2016, 17, I was getting, you can sit with the elders of your village. And that, I think, turned into a lot of the motivation, particularly when a literal elder in our community was having health issues and would fall down and things. I wanted to be able to call 911 and feel safe about that. And I realized that we could go to the elders of our village, and we were received with a lot of trust, and I'm really thankful. When decrim nature became much more political, a couple of the other leadership really wanted to take it national and had a kind of what we felt was a rather aggressive political approach. The Sacred Garden community dropped out. We were really just seeking our own safety and healing for ourselves to do good practice, and we were happy to let that group go. I think I've talked a little bit about some of the challenges and opportunities, particularly around community-based healing, talking about having that framework to return to after meditation that can be guiding, can help with integration, grounding, and even moving into community integration to share your knowledge and to grow service and other things that can be deeply healing. Also to allow time for the practitioner, the seeker, to find their affinity so that also I've learned through working particularly in Oakland with the diversity here. You know, there's a lot of diversity, and unfortunately for many of us, that diversity is associated with trauma of all kinds that's been historical and ongoing. So there can be challenges to sitting in ceremony with diversity. Particularly from folks who may have experienced trauma from someone who looks like someone else in that ceremony. So one of the things that Sacred Garden community has had to do a lot of work, and I know that Oregon is trying to focus well in this way, is to offer diversity in the facilitation roles, which is extremely important, so that the seeker can find an affinity that will work for them. You just can't ask someone to sit in that open and vulnerable space with someone who may be related to a lot of trauma in the history of their family. So to have that diverse leadership, to hold space for the diverse community, also seems to be extremely important. Let's see, other concepts to share here. Now this is something that I recognize can be a little bit sensitive. For Sacred Garden community and for me personally, these are sacraments, the things we're discussing: Nino Santos, the little mushroom, psilocybin, the spirit of the mushroom. You know, it's a sacred, for me, spirit. It can help connect to something which is beyond words. We call it in Sacred Garden community divine. We recognize there may be many different names for this experience that we can often share a sense of. And so we frame our church as a church, and we're very sincere about that. And I do feel that there's an interesting line of the sort of secular therapeutic practice and the experience of something that may be perceived as deeply sacred or even divine or godlike to the person who's seeking. So I think to have some mature way of relating to these concepts of sacred, divine, maybe numinous, noetic, godlike, satori, you know, whatever those experiences may be, I think can be useful as a part of the healing process, not to be pushing that, but to be able to speak in an open and the way we prefer within Sacred Garden community, not sort of non-sectarian way about this experience, to recognize that this is an experience that we can all have, and to be able to hold that the person who is expressing their awareness of something that is divine without coercing one way or the other or in trying to influence, but just to hear that and to allow that, I think can be very important. This can also be very deeply healing for communities in terms of helping reconnecting to traditions of your family. Often people will realize meaning from their religious tradition that they hadn't realized prior to engaging these experiences. So now it's like, oh, I think I understood what Rumi meant when he said this, or I think I understood what Jesus meant when he said love as I do. So people can really gain a reconnection to the traditions of their families, but maybe from a deeper way. Like, for example, my father, who lives in Tennessee, is a fairly far right conservative person who's in a Christian tradition. I tend to be much farther left, and a lot of my training has been indigenous and traditional, as well as Buddhist and other. My Master's of Divinity degree was comparative. We're able to move through those political and religious differences because we've both had deep entheogenic experiences together, and we're aware that there's meaning and experience that is far more profound and important than any words that we can use. So we can sort of let go of the words that are dividing us and sense the divine presence that is unifying us, which also seems to be very healing in a community space. And I'm bringing that up in part because something else happens with entheogen work, which is that a lot of what someone might call shadow, trauma, demons, whatever language you may use, that can emerge in entheogen space, and often that can take the sort of sense of political urgency, or that I've been harmed by someone or something. And so along with healing, as we're moving through our healing process, these challenging experiences can emerge that are associated with current and historical trauma. And so there can also be a really difficult sort of direction towards division that can move out of sacred plant work. And I want to bring that up here because I think this is something that's a little sensitive, and we're struggling with the sort of politics and position and power and entheogens, right? So that's something that can come up. Within Sacred Garden community, we're really trying to emphasize radical inclusion, recognizing that a right-wing person from Tennessee, as well as a left-wing person from Oakland, we are all worthy to receive healing. We're all worthy to grow insight. That insight may take the form of different language, right? And I think we have a risk right now because a lot of the entheogen work is emerging in politically progressive areas of mistaking the message of the sacred plants with the message, for example, of a far left political movement. And I'm not saying I personally identify with a relatively far left kind of political position, but we're really trying to be careful within Sacred Garden community, at least, to recognize that the healing that we experience, it may actually be something that sort of frees us from the dogma of our position and allows us to see diverse perspectives and allows us to recognize that there may be meaning that's deeper than the words and the sort of fights that we have. And that's a challenge, and that's not something that we've moved through, but that's a message that at least I'm trying to share, that these entheogens can bring up the demons that divide us and make those very clear and can clarify those things. But I'm asking us not to identify with those demons, but rather to ask them, how can we, I'll use a sort of cliche, how can we feed those demons love in a way that we can also learn to become more closely connected with those from whom we may have different ways of defining our experience of the world. So that's a little bit of some of the challenges and opportunities that I'm finding around community healing. All right, I think I'm doing okay for time, and I'll wrap up here in just a minute.
Yeah, this is Anne Marie. Yeah, go ahead. Take a couple more minutes, and then we'll open it up to questions from the board.
Fantastic, really good. So at the very last, I thought I would talk a little bit about sort of the intersection of traditional practice and modern practice, and even fancy word, sort of a positive postmodern. My divinity studies at University of Chicago were focusing on epistemology and how we know things, and I was really thankful to have the just profound privilege of being able to have a real comparative experience of traditional practices, going to Brazil, even experiencing a bruja ceremony in the Philippines, Guatemala, many journeys in Mexico, like that, as well as throughout the United States. And and also engaging modern practice, having journeys with Ann and Sasha Shulgin and Terrence McKenna, and studying with Frank Barron from the Harvard Club. And so looking at these things together, I feel that there are maybe some messages that might be useful. I'm also thankful to have had the privilege to have traveled and to have received permissions to return traditional plants and practices to the United States, and permissions to share those plants and practices. So that's something that I'm grateful for, but recognizing that not everyone has that privilege, I'm thankful that Oregon is looking at ways of moving these what I consider sacraments into communities through other routes. Within Sacred Garden community, we're integrating our experiences of traditional practices. For example, the practices that I'm most familiar with in the Mazatecan regions of Mexico, and also the modern practices using language around, for example, trauma and shadow work and things like this. So we really try to recognize that there may be different languages and cultures that are describing some processes that may vary from person to person and culture, but that are also similar. So we're really trying to understand those things. Part of this, which may be a little touchy for this group, is my teachers in Mexico, and our own experience has been that working with multiple sacraments, not only, for example, psilocybin, can be extremely important and very useful. There are folks who are in different places in their lives, and different sacraments may have different really important benefits, and it may be difficult to move through a different experience that a different sacrament may bring. For example, if a person's dealing with a lot of deep shame or a lot of deep anger, psilocybin can be quite challenging, and depending on where the person is coming from, that might be something that could even bring them into more of a spiraling sense. If you have 4 or 6 hours where you're just experiencing nothing but really deep shame, it can be very hard to integrate. That person might really benefit by MDMA work, for example, to start. And you want to have a careful intake with health and safety screening, preferably from, in my opinion, often it would be beneficial to have a trained clinical therapist, or at least someone with a very long history of experience, not someone who's just gone through 160 hours of training. You want to do a really careful health and safety screening, take your time with that, avoiding work I would propose in the United States with people who are over on the psychosis side of the spectrum, focusing more on the neurosis side of the spectrum. You need to do that sort of work, and then identify the sacrament that's really most effective for that person where they are. And that can be a conversation. We would start with an initiatory practice, not just a big 5 grams of mushrooms right out of the gate for someone. There also are people who are low responders or consistent non-responders to psilocybin, but may respond quite effectively to phenethylamines. So that's like mescaline or some other compound. So that's something that I've absolutely seen in my practice. Low responders and non-responders to psilocybin can be a real issue, even with or without taking SSRIs. So that there are those things that you find when you're working with high numbers. So there are some ideas I wanted to share there around multiple sacraments. And I would like to, at this point, express a lot of gratitude for the teachers who have helped me get to where I am now. Thank you, Maximiano. Thank you, Maria. And thank you to this group for allowing me to talk. Thank you.
Anne-Marie, Bob, thank you so much for that. And I want to open it up to our board members and subcommittee members if you have any questions that you want to pose.
I have lots of questions. May I jump in? Okay. Thank you so much for joining us. I have to change my view here a little bit so I can see you. I'm Sarah Present. I'm a family physician and a local public health officer representing health officers on the board here. I have a couple of, and thank you for being here and telling us about your work and giving us this really nice kind of idea of one of the frameworks that our program here in Oregon can help support. I appreciate it very much. Some very kind of specific how things work questions, and then a couple of broader questions, and I'll be quick. I'm curious about the size of your community, sort of in general, as well as the size of groups that may be maybe undergoing entheogenic experiences together, as well as that sort of facilitator to practitioner ratio. I'm curious what you have seen work, not work, and anything you have to guide us around that.
Mhm.
I am also curious about sort of how your community and the makeup of seekers, the makeup of community has changed since your website says you became sort of above ground in April of 2020.
Mhm.
It's an interesting time for a shift in community. I'm curious about that. And then I have lots more, but my final one right now is there anything that you've heard our subcommittee discussing or our board discussing in general that makes you nervous around your type of community being supported by the program that we're building here in Oregon?
Okay, got it. Concerns. Thank you. Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, and nice to be meeting. Yeah, appreciate the questions. Yeah. Church size. So this is a really lovely and interesting question. Someone was asking me recently, it's like, when did you think the church was really founded? And we were feeling sort of deep, and I really mean this sincerely, though. It's like, I think in some sense the church was founded, through millennia of ancestral work, so it's a process that I think my family, which I could express as were Quakers until very recently. And then on my dad's side of the family, there are two doctors and two preachers and a nurse who married a preacher, so this is sort of in this tradition. So it's hard to say, but I have been practicing with groups since I was 19. I'm 55 now. And was practicing with Sacred Garden community as an etheric body, right, for decades here in Oakland. That started to grow. Facebook and social media and everything started happening. So Open Garden, Sacred Garden Community, Open Garden Sundays website that people joined as members, that's got like 650 people. I don't really think that counts, right? But if I really splash it out, then there can be 150 people will show up at the garden. But in terms of committed members who have moved through the process and been confirmed as practitioners, I think we're at about 50 right now that we've got that formal practice. And then we've got about 150 who sort of regularly are attending, but they haven't been confirmed as practitioners. We really take our time before we confirm practitioners. We move through a process. Let's see. In terms of facility, and a big part of that was I have been practicing, but it was always kind of small groups, more like careful seekers. And then something started happening. It was before Pollen published his book, like 6 years ago. A lot more newcomers started coming to plant talks and trying to come into ceremony. And I found that the tone of the ceremonies were changing. So rather than a single facilitator like me sitting with maybe 6 people who you generally would have experience and would have been pretty well curated, we started getting a lot more just newcomers coming in. I heard about this, can I come sit, right? And I was trying to manage that. The groups are getting bigger, so I immediately was moving to having a hospitality manager and a second facilitator to sit with me. And then I was getting up to like 15 people sitting with kind of 3 support staff. But the demand has been so high that I realized I kind of needed to slow everything down and just start training facilitators. So because everybody kept trying to get me to sit for 30 people and all this, right? And so we've just been training facilitators. What I really love for Sacred Garden community is no more than 8 practitioners in the ceremony, and that would be with 2 facilitators, preferably of genders that are apt, for the group, right? Yeah, that's the kind of short. When we're doing training, sometimes there might be 3 or 4 facilitators because they'll be doing practicum, and that's something I should mention. We have a sort of a similar, kind of like an 80-hour curriculum for training, but the practicum is what's really important because that's where we really learn whether or not we're ready to do facilitation, and that's a really subtle thing. Just because you checked all the boxes and read the books and did the exercises, that is not sufficient for really holding space in Sacred Garden community. I hope that's answering. The above ground actually worked really well for us. Right about the time that COVID came out was when we needed to do a lot of, to be blunt, hard work, like creating bylaws, training folks about actually having conversations with community about what we are and how we're going to do this. And so we had Zoom meetings just like this. We'd have like 30 people on the Zoom meeting, maybe 40. We would go through the bylaws. Part of that was really profound, where we would use words like church, religion, sacrament, liturgy. That's how we define our ceremonies, as liturgies. And people would be naturally kind of really upset by those words. And so then we got to talk about like corruption and retrieval. Like, is because there's the bad parent, does that mean that parents are bad, right? It's like, because there is corruption within a church, that may not be the meaning of church. So, we had that exercise, which was also really lovely. It's been a struggle. We did lose one of our elders around the COVID politics. That person was really upset that we were following local health ordinances, and so that's been difficult. But we've been able to move through that as a community. Just trying to look at your questions. I have been hearing some concerns, but I think I'm concerned maybe that some of that is maybe hearsay. So I'm not really sure around the concerns part of your question. Essentially, what I'm hearing, with apologies for repeating hearsay, is that, this is kind of a corrupt group that is only really interested in supporting a certain kind of psychotherapeutic model that's very specific to some of the founding interests. That's just, I'm not expressing that concern. That's a concerns that I'm hearing expressed, right? And that, of course, there's also concerns around access and capital and that sort of thing. But I'm mostly interested and less expressing any explicit concern here, and just kind of trying to share what we would need, which is to be able to practice our religion without burden, and to be open to transparency. Yeah. Hope that's useful. Kind of long-winded, maybe.
Very, very helpful. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
This is Anne-Marie. Just to do a little bit of a time check, we have maybe 8 minutes left before our second presenter. Does anyone else from the board or subcommittee? Go ahead, Kim.
Yeah, it sounds like you have a ratio of I'm not remembering your words. I'm more comfortable with the words that we've been using. A facilitator to client ratio of 1 to 4. I'm wondering if you have any guidance about, how big could a group get and be safe and manageable in your estimation?
This is a fantastic question. Thank you. And it's richer, I think, than the surface of the question, because the question to me goes quickly to who is in the group that you're sitting with, right? So if you're sitting with newcomers who have had no experience, or if you're sitting with folks who have expressed recent and strong trauma, or folks who have expressed something that's intense like depression, you get my point. If you're sitting with someone who is a high touch, not meaning touch, but you want to have a facilitator really be present for that person, that you need to be there. It's their first experience. They don't, you're going to be there for them. Then sometimes for some actually really, that might be a 2-to-1 ratio, right? And I will make referrals to our trained facilitators to do one-on-ones or 2-on-1 for someone who's having lots of trauma, or they're brand new, or they just are feeling scared about sitting, all that. If you have an experienced group with experienced practitioners who may be seeking deeper connection, they may be seeking deeper insight, they may be seeking guidance, whatever that may be, creativity, ludic experience, whatever that may be, then I feel that it can be, but you need to know those practitioners, safe to have 2 facilitators or 1 facilitator with 10 people, or 2 facilitators with 15 people. If all of those practitioners are experienced, I've sat with every one of them, 10 or 15 times. I know them, they know me. We may go up to Wrights Beach, where it's very beautiful, and have what we call a technical practice. You see the difference there? Yeah. So I think that the ratio does depend on who you're sitting with, and that's why you need to take that time. Yeah.
Just really quickly, do you feel like that's the type of thing that could be, is that included in your training programs? If somebody goes through your training program and your practicum, they get a sense of of how to make those choices as a facilitator?
And yes, and it's really interesting because we find some facilitators are very suited for new practitioners. Some facilitators are very suited for trauma work. Some facilitators are very experienced and they may really be able to help people connect into these divine spaces or other spaces. They may be more, the facilitator may learn that they're suited for an experienced practitioner, right? So there's diversity on the facilitation side. And then similarly, that's why we want to take that time in community, because the practitioners and the facilitators have to get to know each other, and you find whether or not there's an affinity, a sense of trust needs to grow, and then you'll find those that. But that's a big part of the practicum, and often with the practicum, sometimes we'll find you're really going to be great to do co-facilitation for a year or two before you even move into it. Someone else I might say, you know what, you can be teaching me, and you can hold a technical practice with experienced folks or beginners like that. Yeah.
So this is Anne Marie for the record. Rebecca Martinez, are you here as the liaison for the Sub-Equity Committee?
Hi, this is Rebecca. Informally, yes, but formally, no.
Great. Well, you can, I think since I'm not serving as a liaison, you can serve as the liaison today. Did you have a question for Bob before we moved on?
I do. Yeah. Hi, Bob. Wonderful to see
Rebecca.
you. Always a pleasure. I'm wondering if you could speak to, in your experience, sort of the benefits and values of ongoing practice. You started to talk in your last answer about, folks who you had sat with 10 or 15 times. And I think that's something we haven't talked about a lot on these committees, which is sort of the differences and the potential benefits of, instead of one mega dose that, and understanding the cost involved, but really helping clients or practitioners who come in think about this as a lifelong path, and the learnings are going to be continuous and maybe sometimes subtle and sometimes really big. I guess my question is, what do you think is possible in Oregon if we really start to give some attention to maybe group practice and ongoing practice? On one hand, around the cost, savings or stretching things out over multiple sessions over many months and years. Would just love to hear any reflections you have or things for us to think about.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's a great question, and nice hearing your voice, Rebecca. So there's also someone who's up in Portland, Karin Gagnon. Some of you may know her, Karin, Karin. I don't think she would mind me sharing. She's in the PMHA group. She has a really lovely insight into longitudinal practice, what will happen over time, right? And I think that this is something very important that we really miss. And there are these things that you can sort of experience that often will happen. So I'm not going to do it, but you can almost draw a little line of sort of levels of integration and different experiences that can move across time. So often right after a strong practice, there can be this extreme sense of joyous breakthrough that can be sort of that positive life transforming. You want to go tell everybody, and all of those things will often happen after the first one or two journeys. That can lead to inflation, which can be really challenging for family members and friends and people who are on the other side of policy disputes or whatever it may be. And then that can then move into a really sort of a trough of despair that can go on for a couple of years after. So, the Johns Hopkins studies are great, but you need to kind of see what happens over time. And that's where also having supporting community can be extremely helpful, so that when you're moving through a process that may take 6 months, a year, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years or more, you can realize that you're not alone in that. So you're kind of like, I thought I was healed. I thought I had moved through all of my trauma. I was in the presence of God, but now suddenly all that anger and hatred, it's come back again. Things like that can happen, right? And so to have a healthy community to be a part of, then somebody's like, yeah, I know that's the way that this can be, and we can move through this. So having that kind of support to move through that transformation that will occur over time is helpful. And doing work over time, as particularly some of the ayahuasca communities will recognize, can also be very important. People will realize, and this is a blessing of being a facilitator with a group that persists, that there are issues that we move through that we don't move through in one journey. It may be 2, it may be 3, it may be 5. And sometimes people can even get stuck, into an area. And that's when I might also move to a different sacrament. It's like, I've been doing this mushroom work and I just keep going back to, I just can't forgive my family member or whatever that may be. So, but then moving through a different sacrament can really sometimes help a breakthrough on that. So to imagine that a single or 2 or 3 sort of therapeutic doses is going to cause a sort of panacea cure, I think is probably not helpful. Another thing about cost, if you can, often a newcomer will want to sit small one-on-one, get your sea legs, get confident, do some initiatory practice. Sitting in groups is also a way of reducing cost. I'll just mention, that can help bring the per person cost down, and the facilitator can still have a sustainable revenue. So that's a side benefit of group work, can be reducing cost. But I think you want to have those small opportunities, because not everyone is definitely not ready to sit in a group. So you need to have both resources there. Yeah. Thank you, Rebecca.
This is Anne Marie for the record. Thank you so much, Bob. This was really wonderful. We really appreciated the presentation and the discussion. And thank you for joining in. We are going to hear from Jon Dennis next. He has a presentation on kind of regulation and the spiritual use of psilocybin therapy. I would just like to remind folks that when you start your comments or start talking, to state your name for the record for the transcripts. And welcome, Jon. I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Anne Marie, and thank you all. It's a real honor to be here with you all today and to talk about this matter that is, I think, of paramount importance with the remaining work that is left to do concerning the regulations that need to be drafted before this program starts, and starts very soon. So this project kind of began during one of the subcommittee meetings where I believe it was Mason asked, what kinds of protections do religious practitioners actually need? And I wasn't, and I thought, well, surely somebody must know how to kind of frame this in a regulatory manner. And part of the challenge, I think, of this project is that Oregon is going to be the first, to my knowledge, government in existence of like a normal, like non kind of indigenous type of government that has kind of come up with a regulatory framework in which to kind of govern religious practice. So I started thinking about it, and I've come up with what I believe, after seeking some stakeholder input, is a way to provide kind of appropriate flexibility for people that are taking psilocybin within the context of Measure 109 for religious purposes. So when we talk about Measure 109, there's a lot of talk about whether it's therapy or non-therapy. And I don't know if that conversation is particularly helpful, because therapy could mean a lot of different things. And I think it's really critical that we interpret Measure 109 within the broader context of the war on drugs, which has resulted in a lot of misinformation being spread. As we are trying to consider ways that this can be done safely, I start from the assumption that it is always better and safer for a person to take psilocybin within Measure 109 than it is for them to take it outside of Measure 109. And so from just a pure harm reduction perspective, it behooves the state of Oregon and the people of Oregon to try to invite as much use of psilocybin that currently exists into the safe container of Measure 109. And we should say that is it safe or is it safer? Well, a lot of people engage in a lot of activities that carry inherent risk. And I think it's important when we consider how to regulate psilocybin under Measure 109 to keep in mind that there's all kinds of risky activities that people engage in on a regular basis, things like skydiving and driving and alcohol and nicotine, and it's not the same thing for Oregon to say to somebody, we think you should do this versus you're an adult, you're going to make your own decisions, and we're going to try to provide a safe or safer way to do it and make sure that you really kind of have some certain disclosures and information before you proceed to make those decisions. So I think that's kind of the conceptual framework that I begin from when I think about this. And so when we think about what religious use of psilocybin looks like, and just kind of psychedelic religions more broadly, I think I kind of identify three sort of main categories of psychedelic religions. We have kind of the traditional established, indigenous practice. We have kind of a new branch of a religion that has kind of a psychedelic twist, as I like to refer to it. And then we have wholly new traditions that don't necessarily have long histories, but that are still, in terms of the federal jurisprudence that exists, the federal jurisprudence doesn't really make any distinction between how old a religion is, because as religions and religious movements are kind of springing up all the time, and that doesn't mean that they're not like a valid religious tradition. So we see a wide variety. There's an organization called Institute for the Advancement of Psychedelic Christianity, and we see kind of traditional Christian, psychedelic religions or psychedelic religious movements within Christianity. We see the same with Judaism. That's kind of a new, and big. That's one of the more kind of predominant threads in modern psychedelic, kind of contemporary psychedelic religions. And then, we have, Christian and Judaism. This is a really great episode of Psychedelics Today that just came out with a couple of, clergymen who are talking about kind of how their faith tradition intersects with psychedelics. And, this book recently has generated a whole lot of interest. The Immortality Key by Brian Morescu, kind of with this idea that many religions may have had their root within we know that most religions have their impetus or their origin within, spiritual experience or revelation. And as, psychedelics generally are catalysts for revelation or the experience of that. There's kind of a new emerging attempt to kind of cite existing religious traditions with a different origin, and this is only growing as time goes on. This is becoming a bigger and bigger segment of the kind of the psychedelic kind of space. Chacruna does amazing work. They're probably one of the best organizations that promotes kind of this type of approach to psychedelics, and John Allegro is another interesting sort of character. He was a kind of a legendary Dead Sea Scroll scholar who published this book and kind of lost his academic credential or his reputation as a impeccable researcher on the Dead Sea Scrolls. And so I offer these just as an attempt to see what this might actually look like for religious practice under Measure 109, because this could be something very much in that looks more like an indigenous practice or a neo-shamanic type of practice, or it could look something very traditional. In terms of the more traditional practices, our own research subcommittee, during its rapid evidence review, identified a large number of indigenous tribes that have a long documented history using psilocybin mushrooms in particular And, these date back obviously many, many years. And, in the Central American, and I think northern part of South America kind of geographic location. But there's talk that it could be much longer standing than that and much more widespread. This is kind of the famous Tassili Niger cave art in southern Algeria that dates back to, probably 12,000 years, as I believe the best guess at the date. And on the picture on the left, we have cave art showing, this kind of figure that has mushrooms kind of, coming out of them, and, people. And on the right, we have this modern interpretation or modern kind of reimagining of this that is kind of growing in popularity and this sort of thing. And this is just sort of the kind of cultural trends that are emerging. Like right now is kind of recognizing, kind of creating this current type of mythology and that I think will certainly find expression in Oregon's program. And of course, we have these, pre-Columbian mushroom stones that, seem to be, many believe that they were inspired by, tribal, indigenous practice involving mushrooms. So, and of course, when we talk about psilocybin, we, in the indigenous history of it, we have to, of course, Maria Sabina is the person to who we owe credit for knowing about them today. She was a Mazatec, medicine woman who, through her gracious welcoming of R. Gordon Wasson into her community, kind of was the connection where it became known in the Western world. And his, rather irreverent appearing Life magazine article is, dating to 1957, is kind of when the so-called Western world really started to become aware of that. So, within the modern context, I saw on the call here on today's meeting, we actually may have somebody from Sanctuary, but when we were looking at modern contemporary, psychedelic religions that use psilocybin above ground to try to further identify what sacred practice under Measure 109 really looks like, I can identify basically three different churches that practice openly and above ground, and I guess we say number 4 if we add the Sacred Garden community into that. Thank you, Bob, for your great presentation today. And so, there's not a whole lot that's known about a lot of these organizations, in part because they operate in a legal gray area. We do have, robust federal protections, but we don't really have great local protections in most areas. And some, the law of religious freedom with respect to psychedelics is kind of long and complicated, and it's beyond the scope of this presentation to do it full justice. But I just kind of want to give a brief overview just to see what this might look like. And then, of course, we have the Okliuva, I think is how you say it, a Native American church. This is the church that Jeremy Mack belonged to in the New Hampshire case that I've raised on a couple of occasions to the board, in which a psilocybin prosecution was successfully defended based on a religious use defense for possession of a small, amount of psilocybin. And they do have a branch in Eugene that is not necessarily affiliated with the larger chapter, but this is the kind of thing that I think is inevitably going to arise and find expression within Oregon. So the hard part about this is that we don't really know the scope of psychedelic religious practice, in part because of its kind of gray area legality. one interesting data point that we have is that in 2020, a recent FOIA request that the Chacruna Institute discovered that there was 966 ayahuasca seizures by customs. And that's believed to be a relatively small amount of the total of ayahuasca that came into the country, and that was done. So this really could be a lot bigger than anybody currently realizes. And part of this is I will be kind of sending out a survey soon to kind of better understand the scope of contemporary practice. Particularly on psilocybin, where there's just not a lot of data, in part because of prohibition. So I had hoped to have this survey and the data available at this presentation, but out of an abundance of respect for the Oregon Health Authority and their survey that they have currently circulating, I made the decision to kind of delay circulating it so that there not be confusion about, which survey is the official state surveys. But I will be reporting back to this during probably a public comment session to give you all the data that we find out from this effort. So this is a lot of words, but the nexus between a psychedelic experience and a religious experience is borne out by the scientific literature. And these are a couple of things I wanted to highlight. It seems, according to the data, and of course, this is a relatively recent field of study, so a lot still remains to be learned about the exact mechanisms that these things operate with. But it seems like the intensity of the mystical experience, they have these mystical experience questionnaires and things like that. And what the data show is that the more intense of a mystical experience, the better the health outcome of the participant. And so it's kind of a new type of mystical or spiritual healing that doesn't necessarily really fit well into the traditional therapeutic model. One of the study in the middle there with Roland Griffiths, after 14 months, they determined that a large number, and this is over a year later, keep in mind, that a large number of the participants described their psilocybin experience as being one of the top 5 most spiritually significant experiences of their entire lives. It's right up there with the death of the parent or the birth of a child. I mean, we're talking about things that are just of the most important kind of moments of a person's life can happen on psilocybin. And the last article there is from the team at Imperial College of London that shows that there have been significant shifts in people's metaphysical views that are occasioned by psilocybin. So I think as kind of this psychedelic renaissance unfolds, we're only going to see more and more kind of these churches and these religious institutions that embrace psychedelics as a pathway to have these encounters with the divinity grow more and more over time. So, the question is, when we're talking about Measure 109 and trying to find the container for psychedelic healing, what is the best model for that? And what's the best container for it? And, the therapy piece is a relatively recent experience. I don't think outside of the use of psychedelics, there's been, typically people don't think about outside of psychedelic therapy going into their therapist's office to have spiritual experiences. They typically think of those as being cited within a religious community. And I think, and there's different things for different people, but I just kind of want to really anchor this. If the mechanism of psychedelic healing is largely spiritual in nature, it only kind of makes sense on a certain level that it be housed in a more of a spiritual container or a religious container rather than therapeutic. And it's not that there's only room for one. I think there's room for all, but I just really want to kind of emphasize that part of it. So luckily, when we're thinking about how Oregon can regulate this, there's a lot of this talk that, because Oregon's the first state to ever have anything like this, there's a lot of reinventing the wheel, or, not even reinventing it, but just inventing it, because there's not a program anywhere that really does this on the kind of scale that Oregon's now looking. And fortunately, we don't have to reinvent the wheel within the context of psychedelic religious practice. There's already been extensive legal history and litigation around to determine what is the appropriate scope of rights of a religious practitioner who uses some kind of psychedelic or plant medicine as either as a sacrament or as an adjunct to their religious practice. And of course, we're not going to be able to do justice to this in the short time that we have today. But essentially, what I wanted to emphasize here is that Oregon has a pretty unique and interesting history in this, considering now we tend to be at the very forefront of drug policy, really in the world, but certainly in the United States. But this case, Oregon v. Smith, is kind of one of the more regressive pieces of Oregon drug policy that we've ever kind of had. So essentially, the case Oregon v. Smith was about two drug treatment counselors who were Native Americans and belonged to the Native American Church. Their superiors at their work found out that they were, taking peyote for religious purposes and fired them. And that case went all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court. And at the U.S. Supreme Court, it was decided that a state really has the right to discriminate against a person and prohibit use of plant sacraments as in religious practice. So that case, Oregon v. Smith, sparked kind of a national revolt, which resulted just 3 years later in 1993 with the passage of the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. The Religious Freedom Restoration Act is kind of the predominant law that most of these cases throughout the United States are litigated under. When a psychedelic church, a church that uses a psychedelic as a sacrament, is trying to get its rights recognized and established. The other thing I wanted to mention with this is that it's been used, successfully with the UDV case all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court. It's been litigated here in Oregon with the Santo Daime Church. This case, City of Bourne, stands for the proposition that when RFRA was passed, it was intended that it would apply and bind all of the states. And it was intended to do that to prevent a situation like Oregon v. Smith from ever happening in anywhere in the United States ever again. And in this, tense political climate, it was even tense, if you can believe it, back in 1993 during the Clinton administration. But it passed with such a strong, unanimous support that it's really hard to think about this as being kind of an open question at this point in our nation's history. It passed the Senate 97-3, passed the House unanimously. I should mention even Oregon's two senators, despite the fact that this was their case, that this was their state law that was essentially being challenged. The two Oregon senators at the time voted in favor of basically overturning the Oregon v. Smith decision by passing RFRA. Now, the RFRA, like I said earlier, it was intended to apply to the states, but it really it was overturned by the U.S. Supreme Court in that case I cited earlier, the Flores case. So it's still binding at the federal level, but it's not binding at the state level. So Oregon, is because of that. That's why we're having this conversation, because if that hadn't been the case, Oregon would have no choice but to allow broad religious practice. But since we don't have that, the challenge now before Oregon is to craft religious use protections under a regulatory system. when we were looking at this, and I guess just to put the strength of what RFRA actually says is that a law of general applicability, which means a law that is not facially discriminatory. It means a law that is written neutrally, that would apply to anybody. It can't be, enforced against a religious practitioner unless it furthers a compelling, like a really, really strong government interest, and that there's really not another way of ensuring that interest. So to put it in layperson's terms, it just means that the government must be extremely careful when regulating religious practice. And that was the broad, near unanimous in the House, almost in the Senate, consensus that we as a nation had reached when we passed RFRA. And it turned out after the fact that it wasn't binding on the states, but that was the nation's clear and unequivocal intent at the time. So with that, we get to my proposed framework, which I believe you all have probably had now. And so the model let me just say a few words about this. The idea of this is to come up with a model that will grant as close to the full scale and scope of religious protections that's available under Measure 109, with the knowledge that that these are coming from a regulatory system instead of from a federal law or a different source, legal source. And so the inspiration for this comes from several different places. It just kind of, as a person in my background with a degree in religious studies, and I've spent significant time, exploring those on an academic level as well as a personal level. There's that, and then the Santo Daime model here in Oregon, I believe, provides a really interesting and effective model for peer support that might be able to reduce the facilitator to client ratio so that we start to actually get at an affordable program that doesn't leave lots of people out of the service center. That if a person wants to take it, I believe the Santo Daime kind of practice has a lot of wisdom to bear on this. And on my most recent episode of Eyes on Oregon, the Psychedelics Today podcast that I co-host, I interviewed Jonathan Goldman, their spiritual leader, kind of about this. So if people are interested or concerned even about what peer support within the context of Measure 109 looks like, I would encourage people to go check out that episode because they can hear it straight from Jonathan Goldman and have that. I did seek substantial stakeholder input, and I did receive substantial stakeholder input into this model. However, because of prohibition and because of the kind of legal gray area, and also just this is kind of a hot topic that is controversial. The vast majority of people who weighed in wish to remain anonymous. So I wish I could give more specific details about the individuals who helped kind of inform this, but out of respect to them and their privacy, and out of concern for the potential consequences that could come from them being disclosed, it's hard to do that. But there was an effort, and significant input was received. There's also this process that some of you may know about through the DEA, where an individual church can petition the DEA for a religious exemption to the Controlled Substances Act. I believe that process started after the UDV litigation at the US Supreme Court in 2006. And it is my understanding that in all of the years since 2006 and all of the many applications that have been filed to the DEA, they've never once actually granted an exemption. And so many of us who are observing this process believe that to be kind of performed in bad faith on their part, but the actual idea of a application process isn't inherently bad, and it actually provides a good model if it can be done with integrity and can be done kind of fairly. The model actually does borrow a little bit from that. It borrows from Oregon's own peyote statute. So Oregon, as some of you may know, is one of the 6 states in the country that has a peyote protection statute that is not limited just to Native Americans. There's no racial or ethnic kind of requirement in order to take peyote safely, legally in Oregon. And it's one of the few states that actually has that. So we borrowed some language from the peyote, the religious protections we already give to peyote practitioners. And then finally, Maria Sabina, I like to think of it as if Maria Sabina's were alive today and wanted to come and conduct ceremony in Oregon, are we going to allow Maria Sabina to do her thing in Oregon? And if yes, then how, what can we do to keep that affordable and accessible to people of ordinary financial means? So when we define what religious practice might look like under Measure 109, we start with this list of what I call non-negotiables. So Measure 109 has a number of things that are firmly etched into it that may not be negotiated. And those are things like there's obviously a facilitator that has to be there, and you can't take psilocybin. Facilitation has to be non-directive. The psilocybin has to be consumed and experienced and purchased at a facility. There's no outdoor cultivation. I appreciate Bob's comments earlier about multi-sacraments, and unfortunately, I don't necessarily believe that the measure really provides a legal pathway for that. But so that's like kind of another assumption of this framework. Psilocybin has to be sold; it can't be gifted, or and that's actually where it's taxed for the state, is at the product level. And then these mandatory client information forms. So there's all these things that are basically non-negotiable. They're there, and no matter what a person's religious convictions would say, if the legal ability or right to do this comes from the state itself, there's really no way around this currently without a legislative change, which isn't really on the table here. So this is trying to set the parameters for how we could do this under the measure. And it's worth saying, and this is a really important point, that with the state of things at the federal level currently, if Oregon were to allow the broadest possible kind of leeway to religious practitioners, and that's possibly allowed under the measure, that even still that would be less religious freedom than what is already available at the federal level. If Oregon does the most that it can possibly do, that's less than what's already there federally. Just to put this in just really plain, clear terms. So that's kind of a major sticking point. If that's the case, then why would a religious practitioner ever want to operate under Measure 109 if they're giving something up in order to practice? And the reasons for that are fairly simple. There's not really good options right now in light of this kind of legal gray area where they operate. The only current ways for a religious practitioner to practice is either they do it underground, and that carries a bunch of kind of issues, because as we've for those of you who've been following the podcast that's being released between Symposia and New York Magazine called Cover Story, they're doing a great job of kind of explaining how underground practice has some inherent problems. So underground practice is, and then there's still the chance that law enforcement can show up, even though it is in this legal gray area. And under the state law, it may not even be that gray. So underground practice has its issues. You can petition the DEA like I said earlier, the DEA has never approved a practice. I've actually submitted a FOIA request to the DEA to get more information about who's done this, like who's petitioned and what the results are. That was almost a year ago now, and they were claiming the pandemic makes it impossible for them to respond. But we'll see what they come back with. You can sue the federal government, like the Santo Daime Church did, like the UDV Church did, like the Soulquest Church in Florida is doing currently, to try to get some kind of acknowledgement that their practices are legal. Or you can go to another country. So there's really not like a lot of options. So in terms of, we talked about the non-negotiables, I'm going to talk about what's negotiable. And there's a lot of things that are possible.
Jon, I just want to give you a quick time check that you have a little over 5 minutes left, and then we'll open up for questions so that we leave time for public comment at the end. Sorry to interrupt you. Go ahead.
No, thank you. I really appreciate that, Anne-Marie. So I'll kind of try to cut to the chase. If Oregon gives less liberty to religious practitioners than is available under Measure 109, it would really constitute a significant setback into the progress that has been hard fought and won across multiple practitioners throughout the country. It's taken years and millions of dollars in legal fees to get to where we are. And that's, so there is this piece that as Oregon is figuring this out, it's really critical that it not kind of curtail religious freedom for essentially as part of the Oregon model that we expect will be exported to other states that follow Oregon's lead. So I have an article that's about ready to come out through Psychedelics Today. I think it actually just hit today. That kind of goes through some of this, since I'm going to run out of time, it looks like. But there's a number of individual considerations that I think are really important for the state to consider when it decides how to treat religious activity under the measure. I think one of these is that Oregon Constitution protects the religious and the irreligious alike. So rather than phrasing this in terms of religious practice, we have to consider it such that if there were a non-religious practitioner that wanted to still have a spiritual center that didn't necessarily require any set of beliefs that typically we identify as religious, that it would have to be equally open and available to them. And that's why the verbiage throughout the proposed regulatory framework that I've drafted uses the term entheogenic rather than religious. It's probably is a little bit more specific. Here's the peyote statute, and I'll try to get right to the point here. Maria Sabina, again, going back to her, the place where magic mushrooms, so-called, got their start in the West, resulted in a lot of havoc and a lot of bad things happened to her and her community as a result of R. Gordon Wasson and his involvement. He had promised her that he wouldn't take published pictures and he wouldn't disclose her name. And of course, he did that right away. He made about $60,000 off of it and caused this whole circus of people, including John Lennon and Bob Dylan and other people, to start coming to this rural village in a mountainous region of Mexico. And it even resulted in the government starting to impose, like the Oaxacan government or the Mexican government starting to impose restrictions on psilocybin practice. And this is just such a heartbreaking piece of the story that she said later that from the moment the foreigners arrived, the holy children, which is what she called mushrooms, lost their purity. They lost their force. They, meaning the foreigners, had ruined them, and they'll no longer work, and there's no remedy for it. So when we think about kind of what we as Oregon are doing right now with this new Measure 109 and this whole new psilocybin psychedelic kind of program, we have to consider this history. And part of this history is the emergence of this thing called the psychedelics industrial complex. This is the list right now of companies that are publicly traded. And this is just, and keep in mind with this about $4.8 billion of market cap, none of this is even really legal yet. And we are already seeing some of the more, and I want to make it clear that I don't suppose that all of these companies that are on this list are, engaging in these really kind of aggressive tactics, but we are starting to already see the intellectual property grabs, the land grabs, trying to corner out other types of access to psychedelic healing modalities that exist. So what this is getting at is, if we as a society are to protect religious use, the best way to do that is to do it now, because as these companies get bigger and bigger and bigger and become more and more aggressive and try to corner out other types of psychedelic healing and psychedelic use, right now, it's not going to get easier as this industrial complex gets bigger and more entrenched. So in closing, what I am proposing here is a sort of partnership between the Oregon Health Authority and entheogenic practitioners, religious practitioners, that I believe would be mutually beneficial to all parties involved. By bringing entheogenic practice out of the underground and above ground, we provide mechanisms of oversight and accountability that will be good for everybody. It ensures that clients are going to go through a screening process and that there's just safeguards in place that people don't have to necessarily risk jail for, and it just really helps also with the kind of tension that is inherent in Measure 109 of balancing safety with accessibility and affordability. I believe, particularly with the peer support model and the home grow mushroom model that are part of this program, that we can drive the price point down to something that's actually affordable. I think we can actually get it under $50. But the key to this program working is that it has to be a nonprofit community, religious or spiritual community that grows slowly and organically and naturally over time. And I just, it's this cause is too important to allow it to be another vehicle. If Oregon Measure 109 is another program that reinforces or deepens the inequities that exist along racial, health, financial mechanisms, it's just going to be such a tragic thing that as we kind of enter into this new era where we reestablish relationships with plant medicines, I think it's just critical that we give small community-led organizations kind of their own means of production that doesn't require, that we just kind of do something to protect that. And I think that with the safe mechanisms in place from the overall measure, I believe there is a safe way to do that it can be affordable and not just another mechanism to kind of deepen the social divides that we already kind of are rife with in these days as wealth becomes increasingly concentrated. So thank you so much.
Wonderful. This is Anne Marie. Thank you so much, Jon Dennis. Sorry to have to kind of speed it up at the end. I just want to leave room for public comment at the end. But before that, I want to open it up. We're not at public comment yet. I apologize. I want to open it up to board members and committee members who have questions for Jon with his presentation.
Am I still screen sharing?
No, you are not still screen sharing.
Good.
Go ahead, Kim.
I think I really appreciated that presentation, and I absolutely see the importance of these kinds of substances and religious use. I think the place where I'm getting stuck is, and you mentioned this, what we have in our hands is 109. And so as I'm thinking about 109, what we have are the rules about groups. And so the concerns that I have about the religious use and how to help churches are the same questions I have about groups. Like, what are we going to do about very, very large groups? Or how will people be prepared appropriately or screened for maybe contraindications? And what's the availability of aftercare? If you have a large church, you might have a nice support system. If you have a very small church, what availability will there be to help people when they need it afterwards?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So in the model framework that I've presented, it addresses those several ways. First off, it requires that people who come to a religious organization have to go through the standard intake and screening procedures to make sure that those are all there. It actually borrows that, and I think that it would actually help the spiritual or religious communities to have that in place. So I think your concerns there are very well founded, and I agree with them 100%. So I'm not suggesting that we should do away with those in religious use cases. With respect to group settings, I like to keep in mind that these licensees, be they service centers or facilitators or manufacturers, their licensure is on the line, and and in exchange for having these extra kind of what I've termed privileges under this proposal, there's also a set of duties that go with those. And the Oregon Health Authority would retain full disciplinary authority and power to punish bad actors. And I think that given, and one thing that came through when I was talking with Jonathan Goldman, he's a sincere spiritual practitioner, religious practitioner, and he believes, as I think is right, that the community will probably in many ways be the best, will care more about its congregants' well-being than even the Oregon Health Authority will in most cases. And in the cases where they may overstep or may be, loose with things, then they face sanctions and punishment and potentially loss of licensure. So it's that kind of delicate balance that if they do all of this, I mean, if we give them a long leash to kind of do things in a way that's consistent with their convictions and beliefs, then that comes with it the responsibility to do it safely and knowing that there's, complaint systems. And I actually, in my proposed framework, require there to be disclosures on how to file complaints against the church to both the church and the Oregon Health Authority. So I think that concern is well taken as well, and I've tried to incorporate that into the model.
This is Anne-Marie. Wonderful. Thank you, Jon. Kim, do you have any follow-up questions, or do any other board members or committee members have questions? You can just go right ahead.
Yeah, thanks. This is Sarah Present, local public health officer. I unfortunately did not have time to read the whole framework and digest it, so I'm still digesting and trying to get a handle on what is within our control as far as recommendations that we make as a board versus the legalities of it. And not being a lawyer, I think I'm still struggling. And my question is, Anne-Marie, can we have those slides shared with us? I don't think that we got those as an attachment, because I think there's some things I'd like to continue to digest from those as well.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I only sent those out like an hour ago. So, I've been working on this until just a little bit ago. So I'm also happy to continue this dialogue. I think you all know how to get my emails in the slide show too. So if you have any questions and you want to kind of process or work through or raise concerns of things I might have overlooked, my hope here is just to be as helpful as possible and to provide a flexible framework that could be adapted or modified as needed to make sure that if either this committee, the overall board, or the health authority wanted to strike the safety, freedom, religious freedom balance differently, there's a few ways that I've kind of worked into there so that they could reasonable minds can differ on some of this stuff, but I emphasize that with the current state of protections federally, if Oregon does less than the most it can do, it is a significant setback to this cause that many people have spent a great amount of time and effort fighting for.
Thank you. This is Anne-Marie. And Jesse, are you the person that would be the one to send out the slides to the subcommittee? I'm also happy to do it if it should be me.
Yeah, I'll send those out to the subcommittee. And John, if you don't mind, we'll also post them to the meeting date on the website.
Yeah, that would be just fine.
Wonderful. Are there any other questions from committee members, board members that are present? Okay, well, wonderful. I just really want to thank our two presenters today. It was really wonderful to hear from you both. This was really powerful. So thank you, Jon Dennis. Thank you to Bob Otis as well. I think we all learned a lot, and it was really great to get this information. There's nothing for the board or the subcommittee, sorry, to vote on today. So if there aren't any other topics for discussion that board members have or questions that you want to pose, I think we can go ahead and open it up for public comment. And then Jesse, I'm not sure how Mason normally handles this. Are you the person that's going to call on folks for public comment, or is that me?
Each subcommittee chair handles this differently. I'm happy to moderate the public comment if you would like me to do that.
That would be great. Thank you, Jesse.
Okay. I believe we may have somebody on the phone. Well, we have several people on the phone. If you were on the phone and you would like to make a public comment, you can press *9, and that will cause your hand to raise on our Zoom screen here. So far, I only see Joshua Pritikins, and please forgive me if I've mispronounced your last name, but go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, this is Joshua Pritikin calling in from Southern Oregon. And I really enjoyed the presentation today at this subcommittee. And I think this is a really important topic and should receive more attention. But the public comment I wanted to make is actually regarding the yesterday's equity subcommittee meeting, and following up on the criminal background check question, which has also been raised at this subcommittee. And just to refresh everyone's memory, I've commented a few times already, but the issue foremost in my mind is that because of the drug war, people who have been caught with possession of controlled substances, and because of how our criminal justice system works, that they've often pled guilty or taken plea deals for criminal convictions that were in a totally different category from what from a straightforward possession of a controlled substance kind of category. And then the other thing to consider is that convictions may be from out of state, not in Oregon, and so that the drug laws there could be slightly different than the drug laws in Oregon. So that my concern is that the only looking at the category of conviction is really that information has been corrupted by the drug law, the war on drugs, and that the conviction categories may or may not represent what actually happened. And so I would caution the health authority from relying on those categories to make decisions on the criminal background check. And so I had suggested a way of analyzing, of looking at the case discovery, but that may be too complicated. So one other solution, and there were nobody wanted to talk about this in the equity subcommittee. I guess no one had any ideas. So I'm trying to stir the pot, come up with other approaches for addressing this problem that might be acceptable. And one approach would be just to disregard misdemeanor convictions in general. All misdemeanor convictions. And I understand that OHA is concerned about safety and doesn't want to license potentially problematic people for this program. But on the other hand, the record and the criminal histories have been, the information there is not reliable. It's been corrupted by the war on drugs, and I would caution the health authority from relying on those categories. So it's it's a difficult puzzle to figure out. And and the reason I keep raising this is because it's I'm personally affected by this. I was in possession of a controlled substance in Virginia, and I pled guilty to a misdemeanor in a category that was totally unrelated to possessing psilocybin. So it's a personal concern for me, and I'm sure it is also a concern for many other people who maybe are not courageous enough to raise this issue, or their personal story. So thank you for hearing my public comment.
Thank you, Joshua. Up next, we've got Jyoti Ma, and we have about 12 minutes left and 3 people with hands raised. So if you can limit your comments, everyone, to 2 or 3 minutes apiece, we'll be good on time. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I want to say thank you to Jon Dennis for presenting so well on the concerns and solutions for religions. It's really important. There's a lot of spiritual practitioners out there. They do what they do very well. Their traditions are time honored. They have ethics and integrity, and they deserve the same equal opportunity to get above ground. And I just really appreciate, Jon, very much your presentation, and really grateful that you took the time and had the passion for it. And there's a lot of spiritual providers out there that are counting on the board taking these recommendations to heart. So thank you.
Thank you. P Sanctuary.
Hey, thanks. It's Sanctuary. So just, a reference to psilocybin, our sacred mushrooms. There's so much to say here, and I just want to reach out, welcome to anybody that would like to talk to me personally. Eric at sanctuary.org. I've been working with psilocybin for 20 plus years. Sanctuary has been established for going on in a year now. We've got about 100 members from all around the country, multiple from Oregon as well. And there are a couple of issues that are really at stake here. The biggest thing that comes to my mind that I think needs to be addressed by the committee is the fact that the DEA is not permitting or is not responding to applications for Schedule I permission for religious exemption. Our attorneys who have worked with many, many psychedelic churches have advised us that it is the religious right of the organization to declare its righteousness, if you will, and that the burden of proof is on the government, not on the organization to prove to the government that we belong. And then I think that it's really important to point out the fact that these mushrooms in their indigenous use were specifically wild harvested mushrooms. And so to, require that these mushrooms be cultivated only and never be collected when there is such an abundance, particularly in the Pacific Northwest, of incredible wild only sacred mushrooms is really a disservice to the sacredness of the plants that the earth provides us. So there's so much more that I'd love to talk about. I'm just really grateful that I was informed of this meeting today. I'm grateful, Jon, your presentation was outstanding, and I'd love to talk to you personally a little bit more. So I don't want to take up a lot of time. Just want to invite anybody that would like to talk with me or my community more about what we're doing to filter applicants and to really keep everybody safe. And please reach out to Eric at sanctuary.org.
Thank you, Eric. Up next, we have Kyle Meyer.
Thank you. Can you all hear me? This is Kyle Meyer. Okay, thank you. This is Kyle Meyer for the record. I wanted to begin by also echoing the other comments regarding the quality of presentations and the speakers that were before the licensing subcommittee today, and the enormous topical breadth and the importance of all subjects considered. My comments, however, are a little more tangential in nature, but really wanting to address something I consider a paradoxical situation with respect to the current licensing categories and being able to expand this program in future years. Now, I look at this again from a standpoint of filling in knowledge gaps that are presently readily acknowledged by this board and the research community broadly. Now, to the best of my understanding, if someone wishes to pursue licensure with the state and also seek to achieve federal compliance as well, there's an order of operations there that first requires state permission. And if assuming I'm not mistaken there, and this points to DEA Form 225 again, then there's one category that is not addressed in Measure 109 at present in any regard, and that is a research license, which is an available category for DEA licensure. Now, in my mind, particularly on the cultivation end, there are certain species that are being considered for recommendation to prohibit in this, at least in this first year of the program, certain species of psilocybin mushrooms, particularly those that grow on wood. Now, my question is, how do we ever resolve some of the research needs to understand, what is the mechanism that is behind phenomena like wood lovers paralysis? What is the mechanism for obtaining that necessary knowledge to be able to then take the necessary steps to expand potential cultivation beyond one species, Psilocybe cubensis, that is presently recommended? Without some means to address that, and again, not with any intent to distribute these species of concern in a cultivation standpoint, I just worry that there's no way to really move this discussion forward without some sort of breach of the system or again, some sort of underground activity to pursue those questions. So I implore the board and the licensing subcommittee to consider this issue in terms of being able to address, again, many of these critical knowledge gaps and to be able to fill them appropriately through the realm of research. And maybe this could be a subcategorization of an existing license category, which would prevent the need to require a brand new category from the ether, if you will. But I feel like without creating this opportunity to be able to fill those critical knowledge gaps, there won't be opportunity for growth with the program. Thank you for your time and consideration.
Okay, well, this is Anne-Marie. Thank you, Jesse, for moderating the public comment. Thank you so much to everyone in the public who commented, who joined us here today. Thank you again to our presenters and to everyone on the board and the subcommittee. And everyone have a really good night.